Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Better Satellite World, the podcast of Space and Satellite Professionals International. I'm Lou Zaccarella. Well, today we continue our deep dive into new public-private partnerships with a look today at policies and regulations and an idea or two about what might come down the road that will enable our commercial sectors to flourish as we go forward over the next 5 to 10 years. With me today are Abhishek Malhotra and Natalia Vicente, and they will help us better understand this issue and, as I say, speculate a little bit on it as well. But before I formally introduce you to them, this series, Making Space for Space, is brought to you by Artel. Artel, connecting with confidence. The Better Satellite World podcast is also funded in part by the corporate partners of SSPI, Northrop Grumman, EchoStar Hughes, Access Intelligence, and the law firm of K&L Gates. Additional support comes from the 3,000 members of SSPI and its chapters around the world. Thank you, SSPI. Abhishek Malhotra is a familiar voice here at SSPI. As the founding partner of TMT Law Practice, Mr. Malhotra has 2 decades of experience with expertise in intellectual property, technology, media, and telecommunications, as well as commercial disputes. He is a graduate of the National Law School, India University in Bangalore. He is admitted to the state bars of California here in the United States and Delhi. Natalia Vicente is the Director of Public Affairs and Communications at the EMEA Satellite Operators Association. You probably know it as ESOA, based in Brussels, where she works with member companies to advocate for the satellite industry. Ms. Vicente focuses on the development agenda, where she collaborates with international organizations to make sure national governments understand the importance of using satellite communication services to solve digital divide, educational, and health issues in their countries. It's important work, and of course, partnerships play a fundamental role. They join me today to discuss policy and regulatory challenges for the emerging commercial space industry. Welcome, both of you.
Thanks, Lou. Thank you so much for having us here. And I really look forward to this conversation today.
Well, it's always great to have you here.
Thank you very much, Lou. It's a pleasure to be here with you all today.
Likewise, Natalia. And it's good to finally get you on a podcast. Well, let me start. There's been concern, I have to say, among the entrepreneurial class that as we shift from a public sector funded industry to a more expansive commercial industry, that current regulations may be too cumbersome or do not reflect the needs of the future. So I'd like to ask both of you whether you generally agree. Abhishek, why don't I start with you?
Sure, absolutely, Lou. In terms of how it's been developing in the latest scheme of things, we talk about technology, we talk about the next generation, we talk about perhaps, if I can use an adage from one of the James Bond films, the world is not enough.
Right.
So certainly it is definitely very high on the agenda of governments. It is certainly weaving its way through into those countries, including, let's say, India, and I would perhaps talk much more about it in the course of this podcast, on the policy and the regulatory sphere. And it's interesting because it's being fueled, at least in India, and I would say to a larger part of the world as well, by up and coming companies. You can call them startups, you can call them original service providers, but that's where this is sort of headed.
Right. Natalia, let me ask that question and perhaps give a little bit of a different coloration to it. You work with a lot of CEOs and again, companies that are growing. Obviously, space sustainability is an issue now, commercialization. Is there a sense among the private sector leadership that things need to move a little faster, that perhaps regulations are either cumbersome or perhaps somewhat archaic and need to have a refresh?
Thank you very much, Lou. Well, it's true. So with SOA, we work with all the CEOs from our member companies, and that is that gives us a lot of strategic vision, and we have firsthand what the companies are looking forward and how they are evolving. And SOA represents not only global companies, but also regional and local operators, and also companies that work in different LEO and MEO or multi-orbit projects. And so already in our association, we have a view of the complexity of the industry and how it has been evolving during the last few years and how it looks to evolve in the future. So I agree that the regulation that we have needs to adapt to what is happening, and for sure needs to be more dynamic in how the industry is moving forward, because it moves at a speed that it wasn't like that before. Mm-hmm. And we need to take into account the interest of all the players that are now in the market.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I was getting at. Thank you for that. There are a lot more players, different types of companies, different means of financing. I mean, it has become a much more richer and complex environment. Is there an area that you can focus on, or that you're thinking about at ESOA and saying, we'd like to advocate a little bit more for this type of regulatory change, or we see this requirement that needs to be met for things to move a little faster?
So there's one main topic, and I think we have been working with our members during the last couple of years, I would say, and have a special focus. And as you mentioned before, is in space sustainability, where we really think that we need to move faster than the speed that we are doing right now, not only the private sector, but in collaboration with the governments and at an international level, because we risk starting doing things now in a pace that is not going to be enough for when the problems are going to come to us. No, and I think it's very interesting to see how the industry is asking for this collaboration to be able to have a regulation that will allow us to use this space in a sustainable manner for a longer period of time. No, so I do believe that it's not about doing a lot of things and having a lot of initiatives, but really focus and try to work as fast as possible, because the industry is going to move. We have been launching satellites, especially now with the mega constellations and LEO projects, in a faster pace than ever. And we need that regulation comes at the same speed to be able to help the industry for it, not after the problems arises.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because you're seeing this tension between, the power of capitalism, which is, a very efficient way to use money and to develop things around the resources available. And again, it trying to balance itself, Abhishek, in a sector of the economy, space and satellite, which has historically been the domain of governments, or at least governments initiated what we do. Governments may say to us, Abhishek, and I'm thinking of India, it's possible that we're under-regulated. And so, first of all, I want to get your take on that. And to follow that, I'd like your view on what the role of the public sector should be as we continue, as Natalia says, to advance into this much more sophisticated and complex form of industry.
Lou, I'm a firm believer that the public sector needs to play a role in any area of business activity, only to the limited aspect of getting an industry moving, maybe lay the ground rules, set out the basic sort of parameters, literally go into sectors where perhaps the risk is so great and the potential reward after the relevant period of time is substantial to the economy and to the world, in general, that it's difficult for private sector to necessarily get into that realm straight away. So I'm just giving you, very quick examples of how things have gone in India. So till the early 90s, everything was public sector, whether it's television broadcasting or telecommunication services, or even computer services, manufacturing, everything was public.
Right.
By the by, through the course of the 90s and the first decade of this century, the government has exited initially from television broadcasting, and then from, I wouldn't say exited, but they've sort of kind of taken a backseat from telecommunication services, computers, etc. And the economy, the private sector, employment, everyone's reaped the benefits thereof. And I think the ideal of any government's approach towards any aspect or any activity is ultimately to be at a place where market takes over, a light touch approach, just to get things streamlined and let them work themselves out. Having said that, space specifically is a domain which does involve, I could call it a bogey, I could call it an extremely burning topic, an issue such as that of national security.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, specifically in case of space, there are liability issues as well. So from that point of view, the government or the public sector's role will never sort of diminish to such an extent as it's seen in the other sectors like telecom and broadcasting, etc. It will be substantial. It will perhaps have to concentrate more on the research development, more on pure security aspects, defense, etc. But it certainly needs to diminish. On the other question that you asked me as to whether there is under-regulation, I can speak more of India, and perhaps this is true of some of the other parts of the world where we see the emergence of commercial space activity. Traditionally, it's always been governments that have taken the leap in taking things forward in the space, satcom and other aspects of the domain. So the regulation, if any, has been little or nothing, because it's government that's effectively the licensor, the service provider, the regulator, all rolled into one.
Mm-hmm.
So if they say that there is an element of under regulation, perhaps they may not be incorrect, but I'd rather put it less as under regulation and more as an opportune time to actually initiate regulation that assists the private sector in taking this sort of leap forward. So I just like to put it in a different way, though I don't disagree with this aspect.
Right. And again, a lot of that regulation has been stabilized because the industry was stable for so long. And now I think what I'm hearing you both say is that the evolution has come very, very quickly. And so things need to change. Abhishek, I should ask, though, two questions for you. Does that mean that a model like aviation, for example, is one that we could look at, where we will have a lot of activity in space, and yet there needs to be some regulation, right? I mean, you can have many, many airlines and aviation services, but you can't go out and build 1 million airports and not in your air traffic controllers have to have a consistent set of rules to be guided by. Is that a fair analogy to when you talk about minimizing risk, or is it something else?
I think it's reasonably close to where governments can look to adopting the way forward. I would, however, say that it should be, and this is, of course, depending upon what aspect of space or commercial space we are looking at, but depending on which one it is, perhaps it could be a mix or the confluence of the kind of safeguards, regulatory controls, policy that operates in the aerospace or the airlines domain, and to a certain extent juxtaposed with what is happening in telecom. So just for example, satellite communication should be purely the domain of a telecommunications industry regulator, and learn from the experience, mistakes, positives or otherwise, of how the telecom sector has moved. But where there is, let's say, space flight or other aspects that are concerned, perhaps we should look at the airlines model in when we are trying to implement what we want to do.
Right. Natalia, is our industry to some extent critical infrastructure? Because I know ESOA does advocate, for nations to look at the satellite industry within the context of improving a place's healthcare, educational system, as I mentioned at the outset, the digital divide, to make sure everybody gets connected to lift all human society. Is there a balance that needs to be looked at and continuously addressed, because this is infrastructure as much as it's commercial activity? And what is the situation in Europe as regards that, and the Middle East?
Well, certainly, I think especially now with the pandemic situation, we have seen that satellite is a key contributor to connecting everyone. And as we say, our vision is to contribute to bridging the educational and health divides. And this is also through the possibility of bringing satellite to them. So certainly, and it was being said before, we are a telecom sector that is bringing all these solutions. So to what extent are we critical infrastructure is to the extent that we are participants also on providing the solutions that are changing people's lives. No, especially one of the things that we have learned is that more and more the situation that we live in the world with the natural disasters, the pandemics and so on, is that we almost live in this kind of emergency situation always. And satellite has always been recognized as one of the technologies for the emergency situations. No, so maybe we should start thinking that the new normal is kind of this emergency normality. No, in that sense, I do think it's the case. I think thanks to what we have been living for the last couple of years in Europe, we have realized that there's still a big issue to be solved, that is bridging the digital divide that we still have, and then that is creating a more divisive society nowadays. Why do I say this? It's just because we have relied much more in connectivity during the last couple of years than we have ever done before. And this in Europe has certainly awakened a need to start focusing more on not only the innovative part of technology, but also into seeing what are the changes that we need to do to enable connectivity for everyone, and to also focus on not only the urban but also the rural areas, and to give a field to everyone full of opportunities, and bringing health and bringing education and so on as services for everyone.
Yeah, and you and I were talking about this a little bit before we started this morning. You're concerned that obviously we don't forget, as we get past the COVID crisis, which hopefully will be very soon, that we don't forget the dire situation we were in when we were literally looking at the end of a noose, and where connectivity was really the salvation for many of us, many sectors of the economy. I'm going to ask you both this question, but I'm going to stay with you, Natalia. Is this a policy issue? Is this a regulatory concern that needs to be looked at here, so that we don't forget, so that the memory stays embedded in our political institutions?
So I do think that is a need to change the mindsets of policymakers and decision makers. I really think that we should not forget the lessons that we have learned, especially because humans are the only ones that make the mistake of falling with the same rock every time. No, we always make the same mistake once and again and again. And I find it interesting that we always put digital goals, and we always want to connect everyone with artificial requirements of speed and latency and so on. And we have realized during the last at least 10 years that we haven't achieved those goals, because we have been doing things in a certain way. So if we do the same now to 2030, 2040, I see now all these pledges of connectivity for the next 10 years. But if we do them the same way as we have been doing it until now, we will have the same results. Yeah. We will not achieve what we are putting on paper. So I really think that the pandemic has shown that working all together and collaboration between technologies and cross-sector collaboration is what is the solution to all these digital or lack of digital everywhere, no, and connectivity everywhere. And as building on what has been said before, I think that we are still facing a big issue that is precisely that satellite connectivity or satellite in general is still being thought a bit on a silo, and it's more on a space policy matters. While when we talk about telecommunications, we think about digital policy. And so as long as those are not thought as a cohesive thing, that satellite communications are part of the digital policy, I think we will still make the same mistakes or not, at least not use the full benefits of the technology.
Yeah, I think that's very well said. Abhishek, our colleague Natalia said, stop pledging and do, again, the structural work to work this into policy, to be thinking about this in a way that we think about other sectors. Agree or disagree on that? In either way, could you elaborate?
I completely agree. I couldn't agree more, Lou. Natalia has put it, extremely well. And in today's connected world, if you call that, or the digital world that we are moving towards, everything is, in that sense, whether it is at a policy level, regulatory level, it's all interconnected. When we are looking at the, from a, not merely from a commercial standpoint, but more the benefit that could accrue to society, then there are subsets of that you outline: healthcare, education, connectivity, weather. All of those aspects are answers that could be provided by satellites and space and policy around it. Mm-hmm. So it has to be looked at holistically. It has to be looked at from a national and, I would say, an international standpoint, and a consistent policy needs to be developed across that.
Right. I wanted to ask you also, and again, you can put this in any context you'd like, India or international, because you work in both worlds. Is there a possibility that this could actually be best regulated, or that the regional or state policymakers could be the laboratories for this type of commercial activity and these types of regulations? And I'm thinking in classical American terms about Madisonian democracy, as we call it, where the states become the laboratories for various legislative activity. Or are we just too much of a global industry with too much of a connectedness, as you guys have been saying, for that to even be thought of?
Given the different stages at which different countries are at and I beg your pardon for using this particular phrase, the space race, if you can call it that, or just getting attuned to or waking up to the possibilities that can arise in this context. And of course, the differing levels at which private sector and commercial industries are participating in this process. I would think that it would be better that the processes are carried out simultaneously. Mm-hmm. You do have the lab testing aspects taking place at a municipal, individual, state level, because those will necessarily have to address the intricacies of what's going on at the state level. But this is another area where there is so much of interconnectivity, not only, in the genesis of the public international law aspects of space, but also from the point of view that today, it's no longer about just having a launch pad for satellites to or spaceships to go into space at a national level, and that's an element of pride. You're also looking at the commercial aspects of it. Right. India, having developed a fairly reasonable cost for sending satellites into space, is becoming attractive for various countries and private industries to launch from India. And I think, the expo that is going on in Dubai, which is continuing to so, has seen a lot of international activity, interconnectedness. The UAE, which has set up its own, space sort of sector and pumped in a lot of money into it, into the growth, is looking to get best practices from all over the world to grow that. So I think we cannot avoid the interconnected aspect of it. And so therefore it has to happen simultaneously. But clearly there are certain states that are ahead of the others in the policy making and the regulatory domain.
Yeah.
So those can certainly be used as bases for coming out with an international instrument. But I would think that simultaneously, if there are municipal laws that could cater to the intricacies of each country, then they could also be valid sort of templates to look at when you're looking at an international perspective.
Yeah, very good. I'm thinking, Natalia, specifically of spaceports. I was speaking last week with Houston, representative of the Greater Houston Partnership, which is a big economic development organization there. And they were talking about the role of their spaceport. I learned also from Dr. David Alexander at Rice University, who happens to be from Scotland, that there are 5 spaceports in Scotland. And of course, our friend Steve Wolf, who runs the Spacecom show down in Houston, has started a trade association of spaceports. Now, these things are very, very specifically, for the most part, economic development engines for cities and regions. They are literally there to kickstart economic development activity. Businesses are locating there, starting up there. Those are, to Abhishek's point, those are very specifically local entities plugging into the international space economy. When you were talking earlier about cross-sector collaboration. How do you look at that those relationships between either those types of things, and I assume they're proliferating in Europe as well. I know they are, of course, in the UK. How do you look at those kind of things and this notion that we need a more holistic set of regulatory policies way up above?
Well, I certainly think that there's 2 aspects to it. I think the fact that we all still move forward in a little bit more national or a regional way pushes each other to still improve and move forward. I do believe that the sharing of best practices is a must in general. We should learn from what others are doing, but we also should adapt it to our own realities and our own needs. That's the way that I think it can work, because in many cases what we see also from our region, so not only Europe but in Africa, Middle East, is that we just try to replicate what has been done in Europe, for example, and the reality in Africa is not exactly the same. So we need to be conscious that, okay, we can learn from the best practice of others, but adapt them to our own realities. No, right. So I think that's very important. But I do believe that we more and more need to be more coordinated in an international way, at least for matters that are relevant for all. I think space is also difficult to just nationalize, in the sense that we all know that the rules when it comes to outer space have to be coordinated in between countries. This is what is allowing innovation, whether it is outside or also on Earth, as you are mentioning, all these new projects and all these spaceports and so on. So I think that while there has to be a certain independency to a national approach, there has to be more coordination and more international agreements in what we want to do as an industry. Yeah,
very well said. Abhishek, what do you suspect will come out of the national initiative in Dubai? What do you believe the outcome will be there? Will it be more government regulation, more commercial output, a balance of both? How do you look at that? And again, that's speculative because nobody can predict the future precisely.
Yeah, really. I mean, I would love to be in a position to do so, Lou, but I think
we'd go to the racetrack together if we could do
that. That's right. No, but coming back to the question, I think in any place where there's a beginning of, let's say, an environment which would want to foster the growth of space, it's there can't be a lack of commercial initiative, certainly not. And I think there is, given the geographical location, given the history of how Dubai and UAE specifically has been in terms of an international sort of trade destination, in terms of attracting capital from all over the world.
Mhm.
I would think that the government or the regulatory role would possibly be attuned to pushing Dubai as a commercial space hub.
Mhm.
So that would be my take,
Yeah.
going on the basis of what history sort of indicates to us.
Yeah.
But
No, I think
let's see.
I think that's fair. A mercantile thinking government, you're saying, will think of a commercial market and continue to develop policies and regulations to support it. Do I have that? Do I have you summarized?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Natalia, do you want to take a swing at that with regard to a Dubai, which could be a best practice for a relationship between government and an emerging private sector?
Well, I think any initiative that it's supportive of precisely that innovation, or that focus into investment into the new projects and the new possibilities for the sector can be well taken. I think that the UAE has been investing very much into connecting and into all these innovative ways of looking at the future. And it's very interesting for us. For example, during the last week, we have had the Expo 2020, but it was also the CAPSAT event, in which we have the possibility to engage with the new space agencies from regions that didn't have them before.
Mhm.
And this clearly is showing us that there is an evolution. So from a sector that for many, the satellite sector was a little bit more on the standby side, we see that there is a new engagement. There is a space agencies that are getting created in countries that are giving priority and that want to be part of this new wave of innovation.
And it's such a fascinating development for me. I've been in this industry a long time. To see that happen, to see Nepal, for example, start to develop a space agency, and some of the others that you met at CABSAT. And it begs my last question here, which is, you can define nationalism any way you'd like, but how large a role will nationalism play in inhibiting or assisting a commercial space industry in the parts of the world where each of you practice? And I ask that question because there seems to be an irony here. We talk about our species, humanity, going into space, right? We've always said and thought that it's human destiny and that we're all going to work together. The image of Star Trek, for example, here has always been burned into our memory, where there's a federation where everyone works together. They look a little bit like the European Union. But here we are now, still with nationalistic endeavors related to space, with ultimately a goal of going out collectively to reach our destiny. And so I'll ask the question, because I've elaborated on it maybe too much, but Abhishek, how large a role will nationalism play in inhibiting or assisting a commercial space industry to flourish?
Lou, I think nationalism is going to play a big role. Whether it plays a role in inhibiting or promoting the industry, of course, only time will tell. But the reason why I say this, that it is going to play a big role, is because I still think that space as a frontier is seen as an unconquered domain. It is an element of pride for any nation, or let's say even a collection of regional sort of congregation, so as to speak, to be up to be sending more satellites there, to have lesser dependency on foreign satellites, and we try to be self-sufficient in this area.
Mhm.
And of course, the growing and possibly the ever-present importance of using the space from a defense standpoint, whether from a point of view of, taking it as a defensive sort of point of view, or, the possibility, God forbid, of an aggressive standpoint. So I think nationalism is always going to be an important factor whenever you determine the outcome of anything related to space, specifically in relation to commercial space. If nationalism plays this sort of an overarching role, it may be helpful to domestic industry in the short term, but it's never going to be helpful for a longer term growth of industry, even domestically, because ultimately what it will lead to, and I'm seeing some bits of the seeds of that in the latest policy drafts that have come out in India.
I was just thinking.
There seems to be an overwhelming importance given to domestic industry, and while I'm not taking it away from the policymakers, it certainly is required. The kind of fillip that they're trying to give to the private sector is certainly required. But why restrict it only to domestic sphere, especially when there is a concomitant liability that is associated with it? The sector is very nascent. It is full of only startups. They're going to be deterred from taking on that kind of liability rather than getting a one leg up and trying to take things forward. So I would think that if commercial space is to grow, you need an impetus, you need an enabling environment, and that can be provided only in thinking perhaps to promote Indian industry or local industry, but looking at it from a global standpoint, and therefore necessarily opening it up in the international context. So
Right.
That would be my sort of sense.
Yeah. And our friend Jake Gullish would probably like your answer at the U.S. India Business Council. I can see him nodding right now. Natalia, last comments to you on this subject. Nationalism, it can't be this sort of overtly chest-beating parochialism if we're going to accomplish what we want to accomplish. Again, that's my takeaway. But it has to be something else, something a little bit more nuanced, as Abhishek was describing. Is that your view as well?
I certainly agree with many things that were said totally. I mean, I see this nationalism, we can see it in a positive way as I want to see it, as pushing each other to do better. In Europe now, currently, we have a Breton's commissioner. He's actually supporting satellite, and he has proposed a EU constellation for secure connectivity. And I think this reflects the ambitions of Europe into space. But this should, as I like to call in any initiative, but this should not fall into what I call a toxic protectionism. That is that part of trying to defend my thing so much that I forget to see around, and I forget to collaborate and to work with others. We are in a global situation in which we need to be open and not put more barriers and more challenges to the industry. I think we certainly need to have a framework, a regulatory framework that supports and enables innovation and enables companies and projects and creative minds to be part of the industry, but also allows companies that have been there to provide their services wherever they are needed. So I think we should at least take it in the best way. So nationalism, just to push each other, to promote our sector, but without falling into a toxic protectionism.
Right. Which of course requires us to manage human nature, which is probably going to be the hardest part of this, as we were saying earlier. Well, listen, this has been a wonderful conversation. I thank you both for being a part of this, Abhishek Malhotra and Natalia Vicente. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Lou. Thanks so much. And thank you, Natalia, for being a co-participant on this. Your views are greatly appreciated. And I hope what we've expressed today should go out perhaps to the policymakers as well, so that we can get some move forward on this sector.
Well, we know some of them are listening, so hopefully they're listening closely. And I should add that I thank you both because Abhishek, you're coming from India today, and Natalia, you're in Spain. So thank you so much for making the time to be with me.
Thank you very much. This has been fantastic.
And that wraps up my conversation with Abhishek Malhotra and Natalia Vicenti. For more information on these two organizations that they represent, you can go to tmtlaw.co.in and ESOA.net and learn more about them. And I'd like to hear your thoughts about this series and any of the things that we're talking about. You can send your comments to me at lzaccarella@sspi.org. SSPI is the voice of the space and satellite professional, a professional like these two people whose work makes the world better every minute of the day. To learn more about our Better Satellite World campaign and to see how brands like our sponsor Artel benefit from it, go to bettersatelliteworld.com. And for more information on the sponsor of this series, Artel, visit artelllc.com. That's artelllc.com. For 30 years, Artel has provided secure network communication services to agencies of the USA's federal government. Hey, if you're not a member of SSPI and would like to be, go to sspi.org. Dues are only US $100 per year, and if you're a student, your membership is free. And on November 17th, join SSPI and the New York Space Business Roundtable as it continues its series on ESG and its impact on the commercial space industry. This month, we have the provocative Richard Morrison of the Competitive Enterprise Institute joining Jason Rainbow of Space News and others to discuss social factors of the space economy. You don't want to miss that one. To register, go to sspi.org and click on our events page. There is no cost. Please follow us on Twitter at SSPI and check us out on LinkedIn and Facebook. For Space and Satellite Professionals International and our producer, Ana Gomez, I'm Lou Zaccarella. Let's make it a better satellite world. Take care, everybody.